Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for attending our Heritage Night tonight. I hope everyone's found some good food to drink and a little eat and a little bit of drink. You can see I've already had my first glass of wine. Before we get started, I want to thank our sponsors, Raytheon, for their continued support of this important event that helps us recognize some of the greatest heroes of surface warfare and honor their service and the service of so many other unsung heroes. We believe that Heritage Night is a significant event at SNA during a week of modern, high-tech displays and presentations on what the future holds. It is appropriate that we review our history and the lessons learned so that today's surface warriors need not relearn past mistakes or shortfalls. Tonight, we are honored to have a special guest and presentation on this, the 76th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Our guest speaker this evening is Mr. Tim Gray. He's the founder of the World War II Foundation, a national award-winning documentary film director, producer, and writer based in Newport, Rhode Island. Tim has produced and directed 20 documentary films to date on the personal stories of the World War II generation. All of Tim's films air nationally on American public television and also globally in such countries as China, Australia, France, and England. Tim's films rank in the top 5 of most no more wine for that table, please. Top 5 of the most requested programs nationally by PBS and public television affiliates. Tim Gray has won several national and international awards for his World War II films. Prior to his documentary film work, he worked as a television sports and news anchor and reporter for over 15 years in several states and U.S. markets, including Michigan, Washington State, Florida, Fort Myers, and Orlando, New York, and Providence, Rhode Island. Tim is a graduate of the University of Rhode Island with a degree in journalism. Tonight, he will be presenting clips from his film, Remembering Pearl Harbor, and then having a discussion. I know you will enjoy this presentation. I'd like to welcome Tim Gray.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Every time somebody reads my bio, I always like to look at my wife, and she'll be like, I have no idea who that person is. And I said, that's me. And she still doesn't buy into it. So every time I hear the bio, I think of her looking at me with that death stare. But, you know, it's really a pleasure to be here tonight. I have to mention first off the bat, Bill Belichick just recently narrated one of our documentary films. And whether you're a Patriots fan or not a Patriots fan, of which I'm a very large Patriots fan, Bill has very strong ties to the Navy, as his father Steve was a coach at the Naval Academy for some 50 years. Bill is a very strong advocate of the Navy, especially as he grew up in Annapolis. And to watch him get excited about narrating a documentary film was something that I'll always remember. So I always send him before the Army-Navy game, I always send him that little, go Navy, beat Army. And he'll always reply and talk about that. But if you ever want to get into a conversation with Bill, talk about the military and talk about the Navy, and it's a pretty incredible experience. He knows as much about the Navy and military history as he does about football, which he knows a little bit about football as well, so just a little bit. What our foundation does is we focus on the personal stories of the World War II generation. There were 16 million Americans who served in World War II, and today there are about 700,000 who are still alive. So we're losing roughly about 600 to 700,000, World War II veterans, every year, or 700 a day is really what it comes down to. So we focus on now, while we have this window that's about to close, to get these stories and to tell these stories and preserve these stories for future generations, because history repeats itself. And the military knows that, I think, more than anybody else out there, that history continues to repeat itself. And we're always surprised when history repeats itself, like, I can't believe that happened. And I'll look at people and I'll say, well, it happened on December 7th, 1941. It happened with different technology, and the enemy was different. But, we have to learn from history, so we can't be surprised. And the World War II veterans often talk about that. Before I go into too much more, I want to introduce a very special guest who's here with me tonight, a gentleman we just hired as our new Chief Executive Officer, and Major General Drew Davis was the commander of all Marine forces in Europe. And a very big advocate of what we're doing now, and we just brought Drew on board, and then hopefully he's going to make a big difference with the foundation. So again, we try to tell these stories through the eyes of the veterans and also the people who lived during that time period. And I think that's especially true when you talk about your own fathers and your own mothers, and you say, where were you when this happened? Where were you when JFK was assassinated? Where were you when MLK, when Martin Luther King was assassinated, or Bobby Kennedy? But more importantly, for a lot of your fathers and mothers, where were you on December 7th, 1941? So before we go on, I want to play a little clip here that'll get us into tonight's program, and then I'll be back in a few minutes. But we try again to focus on the personal stories. And for those of you in the military, you also know that you all see your experiences differently. So two men in the same foxhole are going to witness what happened during the Battle of the Bulge in two different ways. So veterans have their own unique view, individual view. And of the 16 million Americans who served, there are 16 million stories of how they saw World War II and how they experienced World War II. And these are some of the stories of where people were on December 7th, 1941, and a little bit about Pearl Harbor, and then we'll be back for another short clip in a minute. So guys, if you could go ahead and roll that first video.
I think that this country should heed the advice of its first president and avoid all foreign entanglements.
This time America should keep out, and I know I will.
I think we should stay out of it entirely.
And all our efforts should be made to keep out of the fight.
If my country calls, yes.
No.
All right, now, listen carefully. The island of Oahu is being attacked by enemy planes. The center of this attack is Pearl Harbor. We are under attack.
I remember exactly where I was. My sister called me up and says, "Hey, Don, come up here, there's some important news." I was 13 years old. I was in a skating rink in Charleston, West Virginia.
Just surprised because we weren't expecting it.
I knew we were going to have to go to war, no question about that,
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air, President Roosevelt has just announced.
I was going to high school then.
I was working in the gas station. I was in high school.
I really didn't even know there was a war about to go on.
I knew then that probably I'd have to get enlisted shortly.
Some of you may think this is just another military maneuver. This is not a maneuver. This is the real McCoy.
I was with two other friends. We were walking down in the city when the news came through.
My mother heard something on the radio, and my father says, "We just got attacked by the Japanese, Pearl Harbor." I didn't know where Pearl Harbor was.
So we knew it was America, and America was being attacked.
Flash, Washington. The White House announces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
I was going out in the morning, and somebody stopped me and said, "Did you hear what was on the news?"
Somehow I felt right hearing that I'd be involved before long.
I was with a lot of my friends, and we made a commitment that we wouldn't wait to be drafted. We'd go in. And all of us went in.
The attack apparently was made on all naval and military activities on the principal island of Oahu.
And I was there on the corner selling extra editions of the announcement of Pearl Harbor.
And my first thought was, how am I going to get in?
And King couldn't believe that it happened. That I remember, yes.
Here's the bulletin. Washington, the president decided today, after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor and Manila, to call an extraordinary meeting of the cabinet for 8:30 p.m. tonight.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
We were told that Pearl Harbor was impregnable.
Immediately, we heard General Quarters, man your battle stations.
Lost most of our sailors down there.
Here you're 19 years old and people are shooting at you, bombs are falling. Your life has changed. You know it's never going to be the same again.
Just below the blue waters of Pearl Harbor, the USS Arizona still bleeds her oil. The rising beads are referred to as black tears. Roughly every 20 seconds, a solitary droplet floats slowly to the surface. Up to 9 quarts of oil escape from the submerged battleship's hull each day. An oily sheen fans out from the remains of the Arizona, mixing with the warm waters of the Pacific. On Saturday, December 6, 1941, the battleship had taken on well over 1 million gallons of fuel. The next morning, Sunday, December 7th, at her mooring off Ford Island in the heart of Pearl Harbor, the Arizona was a fiery mess of steel, burning human flesh, and oily black smoke. The 30,000-ton battleship had become a blazing tomb for almost 1,200 sailors and Marines on board. Just 18 minutes into Japan's surprise attack on the Hawaiian island of Oahu, a bomb from a Japanese plane ignited the Arizona's forward ammunition magazine. The time was 8:06 a.m. on Sunday, December 7th, 1941.
There was a pervasive idea that war was coming, but the idea of in what form and how would it happen.
The Arizona's apocalyptic blast along Battleship Row in Pearl Harbor could be seen and felt across the Hawaiian island of Oahu.
As we stood there, we heard a tremendous explosion.
People were just blown all over the place. The whole harbor was on fire.
Just 335 of the battleship's 1,500-man crew survived that Sunday.
And all the time you're being shot at or bombed or something, and you're trying to do something about it, put the fires out, to save the wounded and the dead. That was Pearl Harbor to start with, December 7th.
The faces of those 1,177 who died aboard the battleship remain frozen in time. Youth preserved for eternity. Sailors and Marines with their whole lives in front of them were gone in an instant. Japan's eventual end came in Tokyo Bay aboard the USS Missouri on September 2nd, 1945, when the unconditional surrender was signed, ending World War II. General Douglas MacArthur, commander of all U.S. Army forces in the Far East, had the final word.
These proceedings are closed.
The Missouri herself is docked in Pearl Harbor, within a ship's length of the Arizona Memorial. A tale of 2 great battleships, where it all began for America on December 7th in 1941, and on the ship where it formally ended 4 years later. The crew of the USS Arizona came from all over America, from rural towns and big cities. They hailed from the north and south, and east and west. Some were poor and some were rich. Their shared connection was the battleship.
Their ship was their home.
Most of those killed on the Arizona remain on board the ship today, entombed within her barnacle-encrusted superstructure.
They was buried with the ship. It's still down there.
In all, some 350 Japanese torpedo planes, dive bombers, fighters, and other aircraft attacked Oahu in 2 separate waves on December 7th. Japan's onslaught that Sunday lasted less than 2 hours. By the end of the violence, 2,400 Americans were dead. Almost half of those killed were on board the Arizona.
There were 1,177 killed out of 1,522.
1,200 were wounded. Roughly 1,000 were missing.
Me, myself, I stood in ankle deep in blood.
The dead on December 7th were American sailors, soldiers, Marines, and civilians caught up in one of history's most dramatic moments. In the days following the attack on Oahu, Western Union telegrams began arriving across America. They notified families that their sons, brothers, fathers, and husbands had died in a war that on December 6, 1941, the United States wanted no part of.
America was an isolationist country. We still had the remnants of World War I, left over in our minds.
Here is a flash just in from Washington. White House says 3,000 casualties in Hawaii. Casualties on the Hawaiian island of Oahu in yesterday's Japanese air attack will amount to about 1,500 fatalities, the White House announced today.
Many of those killed on the island of Oahu on December 7th had no idea who was attacking them and why. Soldiers' last moments were spent huddled in airplane hangars or asleep in their barracks. Sailors and Marines died while gasping for air below decks on battleships, destroyers, and cruisers that were on fire and sinking fast. 21 ships of the U.S. Pacific Fleet in and around Ford Island and Pearl Harbor were sunk or damaged on December 7th.
I couldn't imagine them attacking us like they did.
The battleship Oklahoma had been hit by multiple torpedoes and rolled completely over. 429 of her sailors were dead.
Walter Staff, who was the last man rescued off the Oklahoma, all around him, men were drowning, panicked, dying. And he tried to calm them down, but they were so frightened, those young boys, some of them 16, 17 years old, that they couldn't even pay attention to directions. They just were so scared. And so we just saw a lot of things. And of the 32 men, Walter Staff was the last one out. And he just said that, I didn't give up, but I just wondered if my time was coming. And when a peak of light opened up in his compartment, I wondered then, is all this air going to escape and I'm going to drown so close to being free?
Countless numbers of those who died on December 7th never even saw the rising sun insignia on the attacking Japanese planes. Their deaths came in a flash of fire and smoke. Even if these sailors, soldiers, and Marines did recognize their attackers as the Empire of Japan, it's doubtful they would have had time to process what was playing out in front of them on that sleepy Sunday on Oahu. Their shared emotion that morning was sheer surprise, utter disbelief, and complete shock that this attack was real and not the beginning of yet another military training exercise was almost unthinkable.
I started from my battle station, which was about 5 ladders up. General quarters sounded, and this is no drill.
I knew it wasn't no drill, because we have had drills over there, and man, this was just altogether different.
The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th was launched from a Japanese naval strike force of 31 ships, 6 of them aircraft carriers. The Armada quietly crossed the western Pacific Ocean and sprang their aerial strike force just 230 miles north of Oahu. The initial wave of attacking planes homed in on their targets by following the signal of a Honolulu radio station playing Hawaiian music. A well-marked Japanese chart laid out where the ships of the U.S. Pacific Fleet were supposed to be in Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Aerial photos taken during the attack didn't exactly correspond to the information on the map, but in the end, it was close enough. The American battleships' priority targets were grouped tightly together off Ford Island.
An idea that the Japanese would cover 4,000 miles over the Pacific in the winter with high seas was just, make one thing clear, they were not prepared to receive an air attack.
For every torpedo release that found its mark, for every bomb that connected with a ship, or for every bullet fired from a Japanese plane or American gun, there is a corresponding personal story from a sailor, soldier, or civilian of tragedy, triumph, and their role in that day of infamy.
As soon as we rang that general quarters bell, the first plane came across, and they all went to their battle stations, and every one of them were killed at their battle stations.
Not all were heroes, not all were brave. They were human.
Those who lived through the December 7, 1941 attacks on Oahu are collectively known as Pearl Harbor survivors. Now in their 90s, some even older, their time with us is growing short. Each day, their exclusive group becomes fewer. If these survivors have a final wish, it is that you don't forget December 7, 1941. Who they were, what they witnessed, and how they responded.
These were young kids. They were in their 1920s. They were young.
So what we do when we do a film is we look at a little bit of the strategy. All of you who have been in the Navy for so long and know the history of the Navy know the strategy of Pearl Harbor. You can find the strategy of what happened there anywhere. What you can't find are the individual personal stories of men who were on the Oklahoma or the West Virginia or the Arizona or the Nevada or the USS Haga, which was a tugboat that helped get ships out of the harbor. You can't get the personal stories of the men who were at Hickam, at Wheeler, at Schofield. So we look for these individual stories because these are the legacies that we need to preserve. We don't need to preserve the stuff that you can watch on the History Channel and the strategy. We know it. We know all that. So our goal is always to set up a little bit of the strategy, but spend most of our time with the people who were there, the people who know history. Historians write books about Pearl Harbor, but do they know what actually happened? I always say the only people who know what happened were the people who were actually there. And even they, at times, aren't exactly clear because of the tragedy and the stress and everything else going on of what happened. When you look at a ship like the USS Arizona, which had 1,500 men plus on the battleship, only 335 survived. And today, there are only 5 living survivors of the USS Arizona. And you look at the Arizona, whether you want to call it a famous ship or an infamous ship, whatever you want to do, but there are only 5 men left who can talk about what it was really like. And a couple of those men are going to talk in the next segment, and then we're going to come back and we're going to dig down even deeper underneath what these men had to say, which led us to another film. So I think any filmmaker will say the best attribute that they have is to be able to listen and to listen to the stories and then preserve the stories. So if we could roll that next segment, we'll be back in just 1 second and we'll talk a little bit more, and then this will actually get good, I promise.
Pearl Harbor was quite a sight to start with. There were a lot of destroyers, a lot of cruisers, 8 battleships, and it's something you don't see every day.
Donald Stratton was on the USS Arizona.
I made seaman first class, and we had worked on the boats, shore boats and stuff like that. We were scraping and painting a lot because the seawater was a lot of rust and stuff that had to be cleaned up, worked on.
Quartermaster Third Class Lou Conter had joined the Navy in 1939. He was on the deck of the Arizona when the first Japanese planes came over.
Sunday morning, went on watch at 7:45, and 5 minutes to 8, all hell broke loose.
You see the Japanese planes coming in.
Some sailors were on the bow of the ship pointed toward Ford Island.
Don Stratton heard fellow crew members on the Arizona shouting.
I seen the bombs drop on Ford Island, and about that time I seen the Japanese insignia on the wings, and uh-oh, what's going on here? I was already at my battle station, and we had 50 rounds of ammunition behind every anti-aircraft gun and on the boat deck, and they had to break some of the locks, get some of the ammo to the guns, and they ran out of ammo, and our gunnery officer in the sky control platform, he went to get some more, and we never did see him again. We were firing at the high altitude bombers, and we could see our bursts that were short, not doing any good.
I think we hit one or two.
We were being dive bombed and strafed by planes, and you could see the pilots and everything.
At 9 minutes after 8, one of the bombers came over the lucky bomb.
And then the big bomb hit the number 2 turret.
Dropped it from maybe 10,000 feet.
And went right into 1,000,000 rounds of ammunition and fuel oil and aviation gasoline.
It went in there and exploded. That's what exploded.
It blew the 110 foot of the ship clear off.
And everything from the mainmast forward was on fire. The bow of the ship came out of the water about 30 feet.
Blew me in the water.
Where the fireball went off, and it went about 500 or 600 feet in the air and just engulfed us up there in the sky control platform.
As the Arizona began to burn and sink into Pearl Harbor, Stratton and several other sailors found themselves trapped here at their anti-aircraft gun platform located one deck above the bridge of the now mortally wounded battleship.
One of the sailors jumped up and opened the hatch and jumped out, and then we never did see him again. And I guess I tried to close the hatch with my left side, and that's where I got most of my burns, but there wasn't nothing you could do about it, but trying to self-preservation was about it.
70% of Donald Stratton's body was severely burned. To this day, he can leave no discernible fingerprints. That Stratton was able to find his way off the Arizona and onto the adjacent repair ship USS Vestal was a miracle in itself.
I seen a gentleman on the vessel, on the aft part of the vessel, and we got his attention and hollered and whatever, and he seen us over there, and he threw us a heaving line, which was a small line with a monkey's fist on the end, and he tied a heavier line on, and we pulled that across to the Arizona and tied it off, and we proceeded to go hand over hand across that line to the vessel. With 6 of us, we went across that line.
Okay, so Don Stratton casually mentions at this point that there was a guy on the USS Vestal who threw them a line with a monkey's fist, and that line got 6 guys, the final 6 guys, to get off the USS Arizona alive. So then you start to wonder to yourself, wait a minute, there was a guy who rescued the final 6 men off the USS Arizona. Who was this man? This man happens to be somebody who's being inducted into the Surface Navy Association Hall of Fame this week. And he has been known for 70 plus years as a hero to those 6 men who were the last to get off the USS Arizona but unknown to everybody else. So if we could take a look at that video, and then we'll be back one last time.
December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Bosun's Mate Second Class Joe George serves on the repair ship Vestal during the Japanese attack. Moored to the battleship Arizona, the Vestal is struck by 2 bombs just before a massive explosion in the Arizona. With the Arizona sinking and flames spreading to the Vestal, a senior officer orders George to cut the mooring line so they could get underway. George sees 6 sailors who were trapped in the control tower on the Arizona's main mast, kept there by the fires raging below, and who are badly burned. Ignoring the officer's order to cut the Vestal loose, George throws a weighted heaving line toward the trapped sailors. The Arizona's crewmen secure the line and crawl hand over hand to the Vestal, while flames rage from the burning oil on the water below. The mooring line is then cut with axes and the Vestal is freed. Over 75 years later, Chief Bosun's Mate Joe George is posthumously awarded the Bronze Star with a Combat V for valor for this heroic action.
So for over 7 decades, the last 6 men who got off the USS Arizona had no idea who the sailor was on the USS Vestal who disobeyed, underline, a direct order from his commander to cut the line from the Vestal to the Arizona because the Arizona was burning and the Vestal was also burning but needed to get out of there. So this man who saw 6 sailors on the USS Arizona who needed help disregarded a direct order from his commander and stayed at his post, didn't cut the line, threw a line with a monkey's fist over, and watched and helped as those final 6 survivors of the USS Arizona were able to get over and out and to safety. I'd like to introduce now a special guest, and we're going to talk a little bit about this. Joanne George Taylor is the daughter of Joe George. Joanne, would you come on up and we'll talk about this a little bit? Have a seat in the late. Oh, these are really deep chairs. Be very careful. Your father was a hellion, to put it mildly, when he was in the Navy. Joe George was one of the top boxers in the entire area of Pearl Harbor. He was a championship boxer. He was a guy who went out and won boxing championships for his Navy buddies. He was also a guy who enjoyed a good time out in Honolulu and may have ended up in a fight or two. I guess what I'm trying to say, Joe was not your typical Navy guy. And, well, maybe he was. Anyway, he spent some time in the brig. And when you think about back then, that was a very common occurrence going on in Honolulu at that time. There were a lot of great distractions in Honolulu at that time. A lot of bars, which are still there. There may have been a brothel or two. There may have been some other things going on. But guys on leave had a great time in Honolulu, and Joe George had a great time in Honolulu. So he had this reputation as a real rough and tumble guy. But on December 7th, 1941, the USS Vestal, which was commanded by Cassin Young, who won the Medal of Honor for his actions at Pearl Harbor and later died during the Battle of Guadalcanal, was the commander of that ship. So when the order was given for that line to be cut, your father disobeyed a direct order and saw Don Stratton and Alvin Dvorak and Lauren Bruner and a few of the other guys there, and he knew that he was their only hope. And it took a long time for your father to be recognized, which just happened this year. And could you speak a little bit about your father? And after the war, he never really talked about what he did on December 7th.
No, my family just within the last several years found out that my father, we knew that my father was at Pearl Harbor. We knew my father was on the Vestal. We knew my father was a rowdy guy, a typical sailor. We knew a lot of things about my father, but he was your typical World War II veteran that didn't talk about what he did in the war. He just never told any of the family that he rescued anybody. Back in 1978, North Texas University, they did a oral history on Pearl Harbor, and they didn't pick my father for any reason other than he had been to Pearl Harbor. And I think that was the first time he publicly acknowledged. I think when they interviewed him, they knew that what he had done, because people knew what he had done. Sailors go to the reunions, they go to social events, and they talk about this thing. So there was many people that knew what he did that were there on that day, but they never talked about their personal stories. And I think the man that interviewed my father in that story obviously knew what my father did, and that was the first time that my father acknowledged publicly that he was that unknown sailor that saved those men. He said he read in a book about a sailor that rescued these men, and he said, "I'm that man." Pretty much, he didn't say a lot. It was very understated what he said, but he never went on to tell his family anything about it. He just didn't do that. I mean, those of you who had parents or grandparents that were World War II veterans, especially at Pearl Harbor, or probably in Europe too, you would probably say to me, my grandfather didn't tell those stories, or my father didn't tell those stories, because they just didn't do that. They were very humble, and they didn't do those kind of things. So it was the man you saw on the video, Don Stratton family. There's 4 generations of them, and they started a search for who saved their life about 17 years ago. And
so it took that long for the search to begin?
Took a long time before they actually found out who my father was. And then their family did a lot of work, like contacting senators, writing letters, trying to get anybody to listen, but the problem was always, as you said, my father disobeyed an order. He did what I say was the right. I always tell the story. God put my father in that spot, in that time, for that reason. That's why he was there on the morning of December 7th. He was meant to rescue those men. And I say that because my father got in trouble on, his ship when it came in to repair the Arizona, and it moored on the Arizona. My father went out on Liberty on Friday night. He had Liberty, and he went out on Liberty on Friday night, and he got in trouble. He got in a fight, and the MPs brought him back to the ship, and he was confined to the ship. And so my father was there on Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941, because it was meant to be there. Just the way it was. And
somebody took a punch the night before.
Right.
And
somebody
rewrote history.
Somebody hit him in the back of the head in a bar, and he hit him back.
Exactly.
And he got in a fight. And so he ended up back on the ship.
The Arizona survivors always say Joe George was the only guy who could have got that heaving line and that monkey's fist thrown from the Vestal to where they were in the sky control platform, because it was definitely, it took strength to do it. So you talk about your dad, he was a big guy, he was a boxer, he was strong. He was really the only guy who could have gotten the line to Don Stratton, Lauren Bruner,
right.
Alvin Dvorak, and the rest of them. So fate played a part in that.
Right.
And what I found interesting is spending time with you is seeing all the family members of the men that your dad rescued who would not have been here if it weren't for what your father did. The Stratton family, the Bruners, the Dvoraks, everybody. I mean, there are dozens of people who
right.
wouldn't be on this earth today
right.
if it wasn't for the fact that your dad was an SOB when it came to I'm going to do the right thing
right.
here, even with a commander saying, you got to do this.
Well, it took a person to have that fighting spirit like he had, that even, you would consider that a rebellious spirit, but that's what it took for my father to do the right thing, because he did the right thing. And that was hard for the Navy to recognize for years. It was. I mean, because later on when I got involved through the Stratton family, and I started writing my signature, and I started doing what my family should appropriately do, and it was always came back to us, you know, your father disobeyed an order. Basically, that was the story that was told.
It didn't matter that he had saved 6 lives, it was that he had disobeyed an order.
So what you do is, say that again, I'm sorry.
Disobeying an order, I mean, that's what held up any form of recognition.
And they also said the hard thing is the Navy's strict in its rules.
Is the Navy strict in its rules?
Especially when they give awards, they're very strict about that. And when I got involved in this process, they wanted 2 officers to validate what he did. Even though I had legal affidavits from Lauren Bruner and Don Stratton, whom my father saved, who were still alive, which is a miracle in itself to see those 2 men that went through what they went through still alive today. And they needed 2 officers. By the time that I got involved in the story, there were no officers left alive. So that was not possible. But you had the 2 living witnesses who, you know, gave legal affidavits saying this is what Joe George did.
And there was a written commendation in Casson Young's logbook recognizing your father's valor. Fast forward now, the survivors of the USS Arizona, Don Stratton and Lauren Bruner, who were 2 of the final 6 to get off, had made it their last mission to make sure that Joe George got his medal. And they went on CNN, they went on Fox. Then they got some other people involved, and all of a sudden, there they are with Donald Trump in the Oval Office, and meeting with people in the Pentagon, Mad Dog Mattis, with General Mattis in the Pentagon, and meeting with Jeff Flake and Senator Gardner. The guys who were alive, Lauren and Don, were not going to let this go until your father was given some sort of commendation for his efforts. And the one thing you don't want to do is say no to a World War II veteran, survivor, and especially a survivor of the USS Arizona.
That's right.
Could you talk about the determination of Lauren Bruner and Don Stratton to get this done before they passed away?
Wow. It was their lifelong dream. They call it, as a military person, their final mission. And that was their final mission. And it meant everything to them. I mean, sometimes, you know, getting involved with them as I have personally, we're very close, all of us now. Getting involved with them personally, it meant, sometimes I almost felt like it was keeping them alive sometimes, because this is what they wanted so bad. They wanted my father to be recognized for what he did, and it meant everything to them. I mean, they're 95 and 97 years old. They pack up and they go in an airplane all the way to D.C. I mean, that's grueling on a person physically.
And Hawaii.
Right. And then they go to Hawaii to see my father, you know, to be next to me, standing next to me when when I accepted the medal on behalf of my father. They were standing right there with me. It meant everything to them. To physically tax themselves that way, it meant everything for them that my father was recognized. It was their lifelong dream, because they know, you know, Strattons will tell you, Lauren will tell you that, you know, we're here today. My family, I have 4 generations. There's 4 generations of people here because of what your father chose to do.
Yeah.
And, you know, Don Stratton will always say, you know, he'll say, what's the matter with the Navy? You know, give Joe George a medal. That's what he would say. What's wrong with you?
He was never shy about saying that.
No, he was
either.
never
What's
shy about.
the Navy?
And he told everyone from, you know,
President Trump
up to the top of the country, the President of the United States, the Secretary of Defense. He was never shy to tell them that it meant everything. It was their final mission.
Yeah, and their final mission paid off in November when it was announced finally. Prior to everyone going out to Pearl Harbor, that Joe George was going to be awarded the Bronze Star Combat V for valor, and you know, I think there was a sense of relief with Lauren and with Don that when they went out to Pearl Harbor, and it's the first time there has ever been a medal ceremony on the USS Arizona Memorial, and there were about 115 people there. And the Navy presented Joanne with this medal, recognizing what her father did on December 7th, 1941. And there probably never will be another medal ceremony on the USS Arizona. And it was an incredible thing to witness. And you were able to bring that medal home and put it on the grave of her father in Arkansas, and tell her father, who passed away in 1998.
1996 he died.
1996 he died, to see that medal on Joe George's tombstone in a cemetery in Arkansas and say, mission accomplished. And Joe probably wouldn't have wanted the medal, but Lauren and Don Stratton wanted that medal for what he did. So it was an incredible experience to have witnessed that and to have been filming that. And we have a film coming out this year, narrated by Gary Sinise, that chronicles the whole journey of Joe George and getting this medal. And it'll be out around Veterans Day. But to be a fly on the wall and watch all this play out in the Oval Office and with President Trump and with everybody else, and to see the culmination and to see your reaction, but more so the reaction of the Stratton family and how they looked at this. And this became very personal for them. This became their entire family mission, because there would have been a lot of empty chairs on the USS Arizona Memorial during that ceremony, because they wouldn't have been there, and other families wouldn't have been there. And did that change your view of your father at all, the father that you knew?
Well, of course, my view, you and I have talked many times, and my view of my father was just as my father. I never knew my father as a hero. So to me, he was just a good father and a wonderful husband, and he wasn't this hero but it's just, we've seen this emotional experience that we've all been on. I mean, I can now sit here and talk to you and to other people and tell my story about my father, but there was a time, and I don't want to cry, there was a time when I couldn't do that.
I know.
Because it was so overwhelming.
Yeah. There are 2 books written about Pearl Harbor that I think you want to get. Don Stratton wrote one that got up to number 8 on the New York Times bestseller list called All the Gallant Men. And Lauren Bruner, who is one of the other survivors that Joe George rescued, has a new book out as well. And they're 2 of the best books I've ever written about what happened that day. Both are on Amazon, and the sacrifice of Joe George and what happened. And there was a lot of that happened during Pearl Harbor. A lot of you have parents, fathers and who served in Europe or the Pacific, or mothers who worked on the home front as a Rosie the Riveter or something. And, it was a job to them. It was not anything other than doing a job and winning the war and going on with our lives. And that was the same thing for Joe George. And I think that's what makes that generation so incredible. And that's what we try as a film company to impart to this generation, that it's okay to be humble. It's okay to just do your job and go on with your life and not, post a selfie every 5 seconds for the world to show how great you are. I look at that generation who came out of the Great Depression and fought a world war like it was a job, came home, rebuilt America, went to college on the GI Bill, and did so many incredible things that you are all right now benefiting from as either military or people who work for Raytheon or Lockheed Martin. It all goes back to them, and it all goes back to men who just felt they were just doing a job, and I find that incredible. And my wife always says, how come all your friends are 96 years old? I said, look at them. Look at what you can learn from them. And just sitting down and matter-of-factly, they tell us about saving the world. No big deal. The real heroes are the guys buried in Normandy or at the Punch Bowl or in the Manila Cemetery or places overseas. Those are the real heroes. We're just survivors. I love them for it. Before we wrap up, I wanted to take a couple of quick questions. If anyone had any questions for Joanne or about Joe George or about anything that we do, I'd be happy to answer a couple of quick questions.
Can I make a comment, Tim?
Sure, Ned.
I had the opportunity to be at the screening of the movie about Raymond Harris, his remains being returned to the Arizona and interred on the Arizona. His cremated remains were placed on the ship by divers. And I asked him if he wanted to be interred with his shipmates on the ship when he died.
Don, yeah, no, I'm not going back to the Arizona.
I'm sorry. I asked him if he wanted to be interred with his shipmates, and he referred to the fact that he'd been burned over 70% of his body. He said, "I've been cremated once. I don't want to go through it again."
That's right.
Yeah. Don, there are 5 survivors, and I think of the 5 survivors, I believe there are 3 who want to go back and be interred with their shipmates. Since 1982, the United States Navy has allowed men who were on the Arizona on December 7th, 1941, to have the option to go back to be interred. And so far, 42 have gone back to be interred with their shipmates. About 900 plus are still on the ship today who never got off. And that little banner over there about Journey Home to the USS Arizona was a film we've just finished last year that Matthew Broderick narrated about Ray Harry. And Ray Harry was on the Arizona. And Ray Harry was a guy who never wanted to go back to Pearl Harbor after December 7th. His son said, "Let's go back, see the memorial. We'll go to the Diamond Head. We'll go see the blowhole. We'll go tour." He never wanted to go back. Ray Harry wanted nothing to do with Pearl Harbor. He didn't want to talk about Pearl Harbor to his family. But on his deathbed, he looked at his son and said, "I want to be cremated and I want my ashes brought back to the Arizona." So after 70 plus years, this guy who put this out of his memory and didn't want to talk about it decides on his deathbed that it meant so much to him to be back with his fellow crewmates. Everybody in the family was like, okay, after he didn't talk about it or want to go back to Hawaii. So we did a whole story about the journey of his urn from New Jersey to Dallas to Honolulu and the ceremony and how people honored him at the airports, honored this urn, this brown urn filled with ashes, how the Port Authority came out to honor him, bagpipers, the USO, honor guards, people in the terminal. This brown urn was traveling on American Airlines from place to place to place. And it reaffirmed the family's belief. The grandchildren brought the urn out. It reaffirmed their belief that America still cares about its World War II veterans and its veterans in general. And you see it today when guys come home from service. People in the airports, honor flights, people coming home, the appreciation. And I think since Vietnam, we've been able to separate the soldier from the politics. And that's what Vietnam told us and taught us, that you separate the soldier and his job from the politics. And I think, to see it is always something I always stop and watch the reaction and say it's heartfelt. So there's a bond there with the guys who survived. 335 survived out of 1,500, more than 1,500. So there's a survivor's guilt there, but there's also a bond that these guys were my friends, but more than that, they were my brothers. So when I pass away, I want to go back and be with them. I want my urn put down in turret number 4 where it floats down and can be next to the remains of all the others who are there. And that's a pretty powerful thing. And those are the things we need to teach people today, young people, to have a pride in what you guys do, to have a pride in what our country stands for, and to never forget the lessons and know that the lessons are there because the lessons teach us how to handle situations when they happen 75 years later. It's a repetitive cycle that we're in. We live in such a society where we're so immediate. It happens now. It happened today. It's never happened before. Of course it happened before. It happens every day. It repeats itself. But we always treat it like it's never happened before. And I always tell people, and everyone throws around the greatest generation and everything like that, I'm like, have you ever met the military today? Who's in the military today? I said, that's the greatest generation. Because given the situation, they would respond the same way as your dad did and the men at Pearl Harbor did, and Normandy and Iwo Jima and Tarawa and Guadalcanal and Bastogne. They would reply and respond the same way. I meet them, I talk to them, and it's in them, in the military. You see it in them. Times have changed, technology's changed. It'll never be like that again, but man, you got to feel good about the military. You really got to feel good because they represent the best of what this country's about, and they represent the legacy of what her dad's generation was all about. So, any other quick questions before we wrap it up and you can all have a beer somewhere? I think we're good. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Oh, yes. Absolutely. Good thing you reminded me. I knew you'd have to.
Well, we really want to thank both of you for the presentation, and Joanne for coming and sharing with us your thoughts. And on behalf of the Surface Navy Association, we'd like to present you with this plaque, and I'd like to read the citation. The Surface Navy Association wishes to express its great appreciation for your devotion to the preservation of our naval heritage and history. We are honored to have you here with us at our 30th Annual Symposium to share your memories of your father, Bosun's Mate 2nd Class Joe George, and his heroic actions on the USS Vestal during the attack on Pearl Harbor. Thank you for honoring us. Bravo Zulu for a job well done.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. That's really nice.
And we'd also like to thank Mr. Gray. I got an advance copy. Yeah, you can stay up here. Don't go. I got an advance copy of this film also. If you haven't seen it, you're going to want to take a look at it. I teach high school now, and I showed this to all of my kids. I teach ROTC, and it's a really great video. I turned it into a grading event for them. Many of them don't know where Pearl Harbor is, and everything that Tim just said is so true in the video. You see these people in the airports honoring his family going through the airports, and you've done a lot, Tim, for veterans today, because you're right. They would all do what Harry did and your father, but your film has really helped bring that out, and it's helping me as a teacher show these young kids who, a lot of them don't know any about this stuff, and your videos have been very instrumental in helping to teach them and appreciate it. So we'd also like to give you a plaque, and I'll read that citation. Surface Navy Association wishes to express its great appreciation for your devotion to the preservation of our naval heritage and history. We are honored by your scholarship and diligence in the pursuit of historical fact and excellence. Your insights and presentation of Pearl Harbor and remembering the survivors at our annual symposium is both respected and appreciated with our highest esteem. Thank you for honoring us with your talk. Bravo Zulu for a job well done. Signed, Barry McCullough, Vice Admiral, U.S. Navy retired, President, Surface Navy Association.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very much. Everybody can drink now?
They can drink. Yep, the bartender's still there. Again, thank you for coming tonight. Again, I encourage you to watch this video, and I'm glad Tim mentioned about the documentary that's coming out this year. As in this video, the Surface Navy is helping to support that video, the documentary, so I hope you get a chance to take a look at it. Thank you again for coming tonight, and we'll see you around the symposium. Thank you.